So good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Curmudgeon's Guide to Building Drupal Websites. I will be your curmudgeon today. My name is Greatens. I am currently the Director of Drupal Engineering at a company called Bounteous. That means I push a lot less code and do a lot more spreadsheets these days. But I have been working with Drupal and at Bounteous since about 2009. And I have been building software, in particular websites, since about 1994. Fun fact about me, I'll go off script here. I'm actually also a lawyer. So coming back to a law school gives me nervous twitches, so please forgive me. Who is Bounteous? We are a company that are focused on creating big picture digital solutions for lots of amazing brands. We were founded in 2003 in Chicago, but we have offices in San Francisco and Toronto, Pittsburgh, Denver as well. We do a lot more than development. We do experience design and analytics and insight, marketing, strategy, all the good stuff. And I'm also hiring on the Drupal team, so if you're interested in what you hear today and want to come talk to me, please do so. So the agenda today, I kind of broke it up into three buckets. Talk a lot about Drupal. I took some about efficient projects and then some about developing yourself or growing yourself as a developer. Should be about 10 minutes for questions at the end, so you will have an opportunity to ask what you want. So the first thing I want to talk about is what my goal is when I look at a site or a project. And my goal is always to make the client happy. That might sound, like, of course, Chris, that's what you want to do. But a lot of times I hear it phrased as being like on time, on budget. And though those things can make the clients happy, they don't necessarily always make the clients happy. So I really less focused on that, more focused on making sure people are happy at the end of the project. And so how do we do that? Well, we have an efficient team. We have a plan that we can follow, and we clearly communicate throughout the process. So Ben Franklin has at least been attributed with this quote, if you fail to plan, you are planning to fail. And it sums things up. For me, you must have a solid plan in place before you can build a Drupal site, and especially a complex one. So when I think about preparing that plan and being ready for the build phase, one of the key things is to be involved early. It may seem like everyone does this nowadays, but when I first got into the business, oftentimes the experienced design team would huddle in a corner, do a bunch of wireframes, and then lob them over the wall to you. It doesn't work really well because we want to really guide that design. We're the experts on Drupal. We know what the modules do. We know what core does. We know what's easy. We know what's hard. And we really want to provide that feedback to the design team as we're going through the process. I think of an example. A few years ago, I was working on a project, and the wireframes are rolling in for various parts of the site, and every one of them had a hero banner. And every one of them, the hero banner was just slightly different. And after a few of them, I said, hey, why are we doing these things differently in these different hero banners? And as it turned out, the experienced design team actually had different people working on it. And so they were just inserting their own flavor into the wireframes. And we were able to change that because that wasn't a mindful decision. But sometimes we're going to tell folks that, hey, that's not the way Drupal works, or that's not the way this module works. And they're going to say, that's great, but we really want it to work this way. So we really want to know when it's worthwhile to make those choices to write custom code or to update a module. Besides doing that in the build or in preparing to build, I also want to start to determine what the risks are to the project. I'm a technical guy, so a lot of times I do think about things that are technical, but it doesn't necessarily need to be technology that will introduce risks into the project. But it's really important to think those through, because we also want to know that if something does go wrong, like what can we do to change our plan to make the client happy in the end. We've all probably seen the scope, budget, timeline triangle, and I can fix one, maybe 2 of those, but I can't fix all 3. If they're all fixed, I just don't have any way to maneuver around. And I think about Domino's Pizza, which is one of our clients. A lot of times they'll have ad campaigns that need to hit a certain date. So think about like the first weekend of the NFL football season. They already have their TV ads in place and their print ads and the things they're going to change in their website. And if they're touting a new feature to their app, that is going to be touted in these advertisements as well. So I really need to know that I can adjust the scope or the budget to make sure I hit their timeline. And feature prioritization is one of those things that will help you know what you can leverage. Which of those features that they've requested can be pushed off into phase 2, and which are required from the get-go. It's part of the plan. I also want to know what tech stack I'm working with. Now, if you work with a hosting company like a Pantheon or an Acquia, I know the tech stacks well. I know they're going to work. I know they know what they're doing. That makes things really easy for me. But what if you work for a company that has your own internal IT team, and they're going to build the stack for you? Do they know how to build an Apache server? Do they know how to build a Varnish server? Do they know how to tweak them for Drupal? If you're dealing with some of those unknowns, make sure you build that into your plan, and make sure you have in mind that you're going to have to educate folks along the way. Another part of the architecture is really knowing how the data is going to flow through the system. What are you going to integrate with? What are the third-party systems I'm going to integrate with? If it's just Google, right, I've got a module for that to do some configurations, and I'm good. But in other systems you might be integrating with, like an e-commerce platform, and having to work with maybe a RESTful API and pulling that data in. And growing, a number of these are the sites where Drupal is also exposing data as well. So, what are the requirements of Drupal to get the data to the apps and the other websites that need it? Migrating content is also a place that can be a gotcha for you as well. Need to kind of know what I'm going to migrate into the system, especially if you're replatforming. And then make mindful decisions about what you're going to bring in. If there are 10,000 blog posts in another system, I can automate that and bring that in, and that'll save a lot of time and energy. But really customized homepage, that might be a little hard for me to bring in with an automated system. It might be better off just being done manually. Kind of the last thing I think about when I'm preparing to build is creating an architecture plan. Now, I use this architecture plan to make sure that any new developers that come in, or really any team members that come in, understand what my vision is for the project. It doesn't necessarily detail everything out, but it does give the high watermark for everybody and let them understand what I'm thinking about. A good example of this is the development workflow. How do you take something from the backlog in Jira and get it all the way to production? There are some project management things that I might not put in the architecture that we need to document, but we also need to know how are we going to release code to dev, how are we going to release code to stage, how are we going to release code to production, what's the Git workflow like for the developers, if I have any things I want to think about when I'm doing peer reviews, like those types of things I'll fold into the document so the development team knows what I'm thinking. I also want to list out the base theme for the custom theme that I'm going to build. Generally in the projects I work on, we build custom themes for every one of them, but I always start with a base theme. So am I going to use something like Zerb Foundation to take advantage of that? Or am I just going to use something like Stark or Classy and really build my own custom theme? I'll also talk a bit about some of the modules I'm going to use in the build. Now, I won't list every single module because sometimes on the projects I work on, there can be 100 modules, so I don't necessarily want to list them all. But I do want to list the modules that will give the developers an idea of what I'm thinking. So, are we using panels and Panelizer, or are we using Layout Builder? How are we going to construct these pages? What am I thinking about configuration management? How do I think that's going to work? Those are the types of things I'd love to see in the document. And then any key points to the architecture. In the last slide, we talked a little bit about migrations and integrations. Those are things that come up consistently for me, and they're also things where I run into problems, and so I definitely want to have thought them out, and I want my thoughts on paper. But it can be other things as well. We've done work with a company where we've integrated an e-commerce platform with Drupal, and we've used edge side includes, ESI calls, to pull that data into the page. And so that has impacts on the Varnish server and the VCL in particular. So folks should understand that that's happening and how it will impact them. So we have our plan. We're getting ready for build. And I think this is a really nice quote that I ran across when researching or putting together the slides. And I think it highlights a key point, especially for us in the Drupal community, which is we solve a lot of problems. We don't write a lot of code. And it's really important to know the difference between the two of them. So as we're getting ready to build the site, one of the things I want to do is I want to give the developers on the team some guiding principles. I want to enable them to make choices. I don't want to be the person that is going to make all the choices along the way. One is it's not practical because sometimes my time and attention are split, and it's also not fun for them. They want to be invested into this process. So here are 4 that I have. You could probably find more for yourself, but I think these are pretty good ones. I always use Drupal core if I can. If I can't use Drupal core, I try to find a contrib module, and then only as a last resort do I go to custom code. I always have to write custom code for the sites I build, and it's fine to do so. I just want to exhaust the first 2 possibilities first. One is we're just much more efficient. We're much more secure. Everybody is better if we're using the Drupal community modules. But 2, and just as importantly, it's a lot harder for me to take that custom code and contribute that back to the community as it is if I'm just using those contrib modules. If something's not quite working the way I want it to, I can create a patch and I can submit an issue to the queue and give that to the maintainer of the module, and hopefully they take it and run with it. Touch each area of the application as few times as possible. And so if you're thinking about building a blog section to your website, I don't want to touch that for the first 5 sprints of the project. I really want to try to do that in 1 or 2 sprints. And the reason is, every time I touch it, everybody downstream from me has to touch it as well. So more peer reviews, people are going to be looking at that same code over and over again. Your UAT and your QA testers are going to have to touch that again and again. So we really just want to make sure that we touch it as few as possible so we don't build up that inefficiency down the line. I know nobody ever hacks core and contrib, and that's awesome. If you happen to have to do that, and you might, just make sure you're doing it right. And again, kind of back to my architecture document, I will tell people how I think this should be done. Use patches, bonus points if you use compose or patch to automatically do those patches. But have a strategy ahead of time and make sure you're doing it right. And just, a pet peeve of mine is the developer that's in the code and says, I know sometime we're going to need this feature, this code, whatever it is. Just don't do it. You 99 times out of 100, you don't ever use it anyway, and just come back and write it when you need to. So one of the easiest ways to be efficient in building Drupal sites is to use your core and community modules. I've listed a bunch on the screen that I use in pretty much every project I'm on. Your list may vary. It's really important to me, though, that I try to use the same modules over and over again because I want to get to know them as well as I can. As Drupal grows, we find issues between various modules. Paragraphs has in the past had troubles with translations, and Layout Builder has had its problems with translations. So what you really want to do is build up a knowledge of where the gotchas are because they're not always obvious. And then again, when we're talking to the design team, we can understand that what seems like it should be something very simple is really going to be a lot more complicated. If you don't have your own kind of toolbox in mind, one of the other things you can do is to use a distribution, something like an Acquia Lightning. Acquia has a very opinionated view of how Drupal sites should be built. They've built a number of them, so it's probably a pretty well-informed opinion. But you can go to something like that and have a really nice toolbox in front of you. So you have this toolbox, you have all these modules you use consistently, and that's really great. What happens when you don't have a tool in your toolbox that solves your problem? That's where we start searching Drupal.org, or frantically typing into Google, or my favorite really is phone a friend. You all know people that do Drupal, and it's amazing if you ask people how they've solved the problem in the past, how quickly they are to tell you exactly how they solved it. And a lot of times it's a module that you've never heard of. And so you find this module, you talk to your friend, he said use this module, you spend a little bit of time to research and confirm it, right? Make sure that it does exactly what you need it to do, make sure it's going to meet your needs, and if not, that you can augment it to make sure it does. And assuming you say, yes, I can use this module, that's a different statement than I will use this module. And I always ask myself a few questions that I've listed on the screen if I'm, to confirm I want to use this module. And the answers to these questions will vary, obviously by module, but the circumstances will affect these things. For example, whether or not it's covered by the security team may or may not impact your decision. If I'm looking to add a module to Wilson's Sporting Goods website, you can be sure that it better have security team coverage before I use it. But if I'm just building an intranet site that's never going to see the light of day of the internet, you can loosen that restriction. We do a lot more than just write code and configure modules, though, in Drupal. And so it's really important to have a list of other tools that you can go to and use. I have 4 listed. I use the top 3 pretty much every day when I'm working on projects. The 4th is a good one to have in your back pocket as well. But I mentioned Composer. Composer is a dependency requirements tool. That we use to build our projects. It's got a number of different features and functionality. Normally when I come to these conferences, there's somebody talking about Composer for 30 minutes, so I won't do that here. But one of the things I like about it is Composer Patch, so that when we are doing Composer update, it automatically applies those patches for me, so my team doesn't have to think about those things. Drush is a command line tool that we use to talk to Drupal websites, and it lets you do an amazing amount of things. I think you can do statuses, you can clear caches, and all that good stuff. One of the things that I love about it is just the Drush ULI, which gives you a one-time login link. If you ask me for a password for any of the sites I work on, I just don't know. I just use the one-time login links, and it makes it really easy for me to switch from site to site. Git source code repository. I'm not going to ask you to raise your hands if you're using some kind of source code control system. By now, I think everyone does. But I really love the distributed model that Git and others use. We use Git, but if you're using anything like Git, it's great. Again, it has an amazing amount of features, and you can often find talks about it. The one part of it that I use that you might not be as aware of is something called Git bisect. And Git bisect is a way to tell Git, this is a version of the code that's working, and this is a version of the code that's broke. And Git will walk you through finding which commit actually broke the code. And we had a project where we had half dozen developers that were frantically working, trying to hit a deadline. I know you've never had that, and bugs never arise from that. But I use Git bisect routinely to track down where we introduced regressions, and then was able to work with the developer to figure that out. Again, something for you to help with your colleagues, because we write perfect code and we never have bugs in ours, is effective debugging. I was really happy to see that there's a session this afternoon on Xdebug. I use XDebug all the time, and it's great. But here are a couple of thoughts that I have on debugging problems, not just necessarily code. And I really think about it in two different ways. One is, what are the tools I have available to me? You know, we have a lot of tools in Drupal. You can throw things to the log. You can use Devel. Web Profiler has some interesting information for you if you need it. Twig Debugger, you should have that turned on locally so you see which parts of the page are built by which Twig templates. The one on here that maybe isn't as obvious is Drush SCR. What Drush SCR allows you to do is it allows you to run a PHP script with it fully bootstraps Drupal for you, so you have access to everything that Drupal has access to. And where I use this for, the times I'll use this is when I have a problem on a production server and I can't change the code and I can't really change the data. What I can do is I can write small snippets of code that will maybe mimic what's happening in production and give me a chance to understand where the problem might be before I do a deeper dive into it. PHP, Xdebug is the thing. Integrating with your IDE is super important, especially in complex frameworks like a Drupal. With things like services and especially hooks, it's hard to keep straight in your mind where I'm going in the code. It's not necessarily step by step. And so being able to set a breakpoint when you're building the page is really, really vital to debugging the code. So we have our tools. Now we have to have a strategy. Now, there are times that I don't actually run the strategy because it's like, hey, there's an error message in the code and it tells me exactly the line, and that's great, we'll do that. But really, when you don't have a great idea of where the problem is, it's great to have a strategy. So first step is obvious, right? Assess the problem. To me, this means a few different things. It means understanding if and where I can reproduce the problem. Can I reproduce it in production? Using the same code and data, can I reproduce it in stage or dev? Hopefully I can do it locally. That gives me a lot more leeway with what I can do to the data in the code to solve the problem. I also want to know what I know. So you might get an email from a frustrated user that says, hey, this happened, I did this. You might not get a lot of information, you might get a lot of information, but just know what you know, because you want to use those two things to form a hypothesis. So when I form my hypothesis, it's what's the term? Strong. It's a strong hypothesis, loosely held. So I want to have a very opinionated view of what's happening. That gives me some base to maneuver off of, but I want to make sure that I don't grip onto it tightly, because I can learn things that should tell me to get away from it, and if I'm just really focused on it, I can lose the forest for the trees. And then everything that you do as you're working through the problem should give you information that eliminates possibility. And so a good example of this is I was working with a developer recently on a Docker, local Docker instance. And we had a Drupal site that was talking to a Magento site, and we couldn't figure out why the API calls weren't working. And our initial hypothesis was it's a problem with Magento, because it's always Magento. And it turns out after a few tests on the Drupal side, we started to shift our thinking, and then we did a few more tests on the Magento side, and that quickly told us it wasn't Magento. So we reformed our hypothesis around some configurations that could possibly be causing the problem, and within a few minutes we figured it out. But we went through all these steps, if not informally, but it was really important to actually solving the problem. So that's a lot about Drupal. Let's talk a little bit about projects. I think to have an efficient project, you really need effective project teams. And here are 5 traits that I think are really important. But the one I'm going to focus on today is communication. In our projects, we communicate daily, right? We have, I come from Agile/Scrum, so we have daily stand-ups. We have an amazing amount of communication throughout the day, ad hoc means, emails or Slack messages, phone calls, screen shares, you name it. It happens throughout, throughout the day and throughout the project. But what I want to focus on today is peer reviews. And peer reviews are really important to me, and I think really important to the project team. One of the first things you should know about peer reviews, or at least I think you should know about peer reviews, is that the very first person to review your code should be you. Okay? So whenever I write code and I'm going to create a commit and submit it as a PR, I do a get status, which tells me all the files that have changed, all the files I'm trying to add, and all the files that I want to delete. And I go through them one by one. And if there's a difference, if it's a change file, I do a get diff. And if I accept that I want all those changes, I do a get add in that file name, and I go through them one by one. I never use get add dot. I have a lot less problems with my peer reviews because I'm doing that first run through, and I can catch a lot of my silly mistakes. One of the other things I think about with peer reviews is that I have a slightly different take than most people on what the primary goal is. I don't think the primary goal of a peer review is to find bugs. You will find them. If I asked you to raise your hands, everybody would probably raise their hands and say, yes, in a peer review I found a bug, and I know it happens. But ultimately, what I want those peer reviews to be used for is to give information to the rest of my team. If I have an area of the application that somebody's kind of the expert in, as long as I have other people looking at that code base, they're not going to be the same level. They won't have the same level of expertise, but they're also not going to be afraid to jump in and fix things as they see them, trying to eliminate that bus factor of 1 that we hear about. The other thing about peer reviews to me is that they're conversations. They're not like you should change. You have to change this. You have to change that. This is bad. Those types of things. It's really conversation. I'm trying to understand why they built the code the way they built it, and we're going to use that conversation to make the code better. Because of that kind of philosophy, I ask a lot of questions. I don't make a lot of statements. Now that said, I hate commented out code. I just don't like it, so I will say yes, just remove that. We're not negotiating that one. But most of the time, it's questions. If I see code that I know resembles a function that exists in the system, I'll just say, hey, did you know about this function? And did you choose not to use it? If it's me and I have a lot of experience and I'm working with one of my more junior developers, if I go in and I say, hey, use this function instead, generally they're going to do that. But they might have had a good reason for not using the function. It might not have covered the functionality. There might be a nuance that I didn't catch. But I really want them to push back and have this conversation. And so asking a question gives them that opportunity to do it without feeling stress of pushing back to me. I love this quote. It's funny. It's cool. So when you write code, the assumption you should be making is that it's going to be you that's called in at 6 in the morning to fix this bug 6 months down the road. So you're going to be that psychopath, right? And this is a topic. I have one slide on it. We could talk about this all day. We can't tomorrow at the unconference. But be nice to yourself. I think of the don't repeat yourself or dry principle. If you have, if you need the same code in multiple spots, like make it a function. It's easier to test. It's easier to fix. If the code moves all around and you have like 20 versions of it, it becomes obviously a lot harder to maintain. So follow that principle if you can. There's the single responsibility principle. Things should do one thing. A variable should hold one value. A function should do one thing. A class should describe one thing. By using that single responsibility principle, we just make the code a lot easier to read, which is really important if I'm coming back to this code infrequently. Structure the code to be self-documenting. To me, what this means is, again, if I'm following the single responsibility principle, I can write functions like, get account balance And I don't have to write a comment in front of it that says this is what I'm doing, because it's self-documenting to me. The variables should be self-documenting. Again, we want to be able to come back to this code a long time from now and be able to read it. And then comment where appropriate. This, in the past, could get developers to throw down, so I'll try to be gentle with it. But I like comments at the top of a file to describe what the file is doing. I like comments at the top of a function to let me know what the function is doing. What are the inputs, what are the outputs? Beyond that, I want to be really particular with my comments. I really want to save them for this is important business logic that needs to be described. This is a tricky mathematical function that isn't going to be obvious at first glance. Those types of things. If you write too many comments, then the next developer that reads that code after you is going to be less likely to give them credence. And so if you have them comments, few but powerful comments, I know something's important when I see a comment. So not all of our documentation is done in the code. We have business analysts and project managers to share information with and to get it from. So have another place to write this documentation. For us, it's Confluence. It can be Wiki, it can be Google, it can be SharePoint, it can be anywhere. But just make sure everyone knows where to find this documentation. Step-by-step instructions are great for this type of thing. How am I going to get my local development environment set up? What are the steps I have to follow? And if you have somebody that doesn't know how to do something, and you have it up in your brain, you can walk them through it, and then say, you go write the documentation. It gives them it's a great way to learn what's happening. And it's also a great way for you to suss out all the things that you know in your head that aren't on paper someplace, and make sure they get written down. And then, for me, I get tired of repeating the same answer over and over and over again to different people, and so I document it. And in Slack, I can just pin it to the channel, and so people can look it up pretty quickly. 2 more slides on just being more awesome than you already are. One is to be curious. You're here at a conference and you're learning cool stuff, and you will all day. It's really awesome. There are webinars that companies put out. I watch a lot of them. Kevin does an amazing job of recording all these sessions. So, if there's a topic that you want to learn about and it's been covered at a Drupal camp, you can find that stuff. So there's lots of great ways, but really kind of seek out this information. Reading is important, not the 140 character variety either. I follow a lot of different newsletters on everything from leadership to Drupal. I follow companies like ThoughtWorks that don't even play in my space because they have some amazing people and are really smart. Blog posts are great. A number of my colleagues write them. Pantheon and Acquia and Lillibot and others, like lots of people write great blogs and blog posts. Books are really cool. Not maybe necessarily, although there are some really good books about Drupal 8, but there are other great books that are out there that we can read. One that I didn't mention that some of my principles came from for development is called The Pragmatic Programmer. I think that came out around 2000. It's still relevant, still really good stuff. I encourage you to read it. What are your friends doing? So one of my friends, Brian Perry, is going to be speaking later today on external design systems. He's really smart and he's really good. Highly encourage you to go to it. But I often ask him, what's he doing? What's he working on? And through him, I've learned about static site generators. I've learned about decoupled Drupal and how you make the choices to do it and those types of things. Lots of great people that are here today. Ask people what they're doing. And you'll learn a lot, and you'll also learn where you maybe have some interests. And then on a project, stretch yourself. Don't just do the same things over and over again. I'm not really saying that you should go off onto an island, but if there's something that is a little bit harder than you've worked on, or is in a little bit different direction, feel free to pick those things up. Where do you go from here? If you do not have your IDE set up to do interactive debugging, that's your one goal. Learn a new language. There's some amazing books by Pragmatic Press, 7 languages in 7 weeks, 7 databases in 7 weeks, 7 web frameworks in 7 weeks. You get the pattern. There's lots of good ones. Pick one of them up. It's really important to me to learn other things because last night I was talking to some Drupalists, and one of the common threads in the conversations we were having about our technology was like we were learning how to get around things that annoy us in Drupal with other techniques. So if you're really focused on Drupal, it's hard to see have other ideas about how to solve the problems. And then, hey, you're going to learn some cool stuff today. Go back, talk to one of your colleagues, and try to explain it to them. If you can, that means you have a pretty good idea of what it is. If you can't, think about it, learn, research it a little bit until you can explain it. I've covered a lot of stuff, and as you can tell, I had some caffeine before I got here. If any of these topics are of any interest to you, I'm going to be at the unconference tomorrow trying to learn some more cool stuff, but I'm happy to talk about anything I've talked about today. That's tomorrow from 9:30 to 4:30. Let me know what you think of the session. What's cool, what sucked, it's all good. So you have to go out. I don't have a link to my page, but if you go to the schedule, you can find me and do that. And then if you have any comments or feedback for the conference organizers, please do that as well. With that, 8 minutes and 30 seconds for questions. Anybody? Yes, sir.
Maybe start a fight rather than questions. As far as documentation, you were talking about in your modules, you like to have a descriptor on what the module's doing.
Yeah.
Shouldn't the module name tell you that? I mean, that's kind of one of the, that's my pet peeve is that, get cars, and then the thing is, this module gets cars, right?
Yeah. So the question is, when I listed out some of the modules I use in the architecture document, shouldn't the module name tell me what it's going to do? The answer is yes. I mean, in general, I agree with that. Where I really think about it, though, in the architecture document, is you think about something like paragraphs. And paragraphs has been used in the Drupal community. It burst onto the scene, right? It wasn't there, and then all of a sudden it was, and everyone was using it. And a lot of us used it, especially in the days before like Layout Builder, to use layout or to do layout. It's a pretty interesting way to do it, and there are still sites that we do it on, as opposed to something like Layout Builder. So something like that, I would really talk about like how I see us using that. But you're right. In general, the functions or the modules themselves should be named appropriately, and certainly anything that we write that's custom, I would expect that I don't have to explain to you what the module is going to be doing.
Sure. Because otherwise it kind of promotes lookup cars too, and stuff like that.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. Anyone else? Sure.
Why do you call this session the Curmudgeon Guide? Is it just a statement about yourself, or?
Well, why is this session called the Curmudgeon's Guide? Because the folks that work with me know that I'm a curmudgeon. I don't know, so I come off. No, it's to be honest. The inspiration for the talk came from a book called the Curmudgeon's Guide to Practicing Law. Nobody in here will probably read that book, but it was great. It was written by a lawyer who had been practicing law for like 35 years, and basically, Drupal, like the law, can be esoteric at times for people that are just getting started, and that was what it was. It was a practical guide to things that you would never learn in law school. All right. Well, thank you. If you want to reach me at Twitter, you can get me. You can get me at LinkedIn. And again, I'd love to talk to you if you're looking for a job. It'd be great. Thank you.